Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Gerald Early, and I'm the interim director of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. We'd like to thank you for joining us today and welcome you. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are at Washington University in St. Louis, which is located on the ancestral lands of the Illini, Osage, and Missouri peoples. My grandson thinks it's a good thing to know origin stories, and he is right. It helps us understand who we and what we are collectively as a nation. It was William Faulkner who famously wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." What these grounds were lives with us today and always. This visit is co-sponsored by the Department of African and African American Studies and the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and we like to thank them. The Black Panther and Wakanda first appeared in a two-part story spread across July and August 1966 issues of the Fantastic Four. The story was written by Stan Lee and illustrated by Jack Kirby. In that same year, 1966, Stokely Carmichael led a voter movement to overturn white rule in rural Lowndes County, Alabama. Black voters, many of whom were illiterate, were told to vote for the names with the emblem of the Black Panther, which symbolized the Black political party of Lowndes County. Also in 1966, in Oakland, California, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and David Hilliard launched the Black Panther Party. Newton and his associates were inspired by the Black Panther image in Lowndes County. The true year of the Black Panther was not 2018, when the first film was released, but 1966. I was 14 at the time and still reading comic books, though not as ardently as I had. All the Black children I knew read comics. We loved them for two reasons. First, they were in color, something not to be dismissed, as we all lived in homes with black and white televisions, and Hollywood still released a good number of black and white movies. For instance, we rarely saw our hero, Sidney Poitier, in a color movie. The color art in comic books mesmerized us completely. Second, they offered us fantasies and myths about life that helped us both to escape from and cope with the lives we had. We loved comic books even more than we loved Ripley's Believe It or Not, or the National Enquirer, or pulp fiction like Doc Savage, or Grace Metalius' novel Peyton Place. And comic books were cheap. We could buy 3 remainder comic books at the local mom and pop store for 5 cents. No one I knew paid 10 cents for a comic book, the price of a new comic at the time. Comic books were even a currency among us. You could not only swap them for other comics, you could swap them for anything another kid owned except his bike. Black Panther was not the first comic we read with black people in it. We all read jungle comics like Qiana and the Jungle Girl and Tarzan, and had encountered our share of Africans. We knew they were racist comics, but read them anyway, and not all of them were racist. Brother of the Spear, a backup story in Tarzan comics, was a very positive comic about Africa, ahead of its time. Black Panther was our first black superhero, so it interested us a great deal, at least those who liked superhero comic books. Not everyone did. With his gadgets and his secret hideaway, I thought he was a bit too much like Batman, but I liked him anyway. I will have you know that we are the children of my time. were not uncritical readers, and we talked a lot about the shortcomings and redundancies in what we read. For most of us black kids in 1966, Black Panther felt like a change, a reflection of the times we lived in when so much was changing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the 1965 Watts riot or rebellion, the front page photo of the bullet-ridden chest of Malcolm X in February 1965. The Supremes made the cover of Time magazine in 1965. If someone had told us that a lot of white good girl art we absorbed was probably drawn by a black artist named Matt Baker, we would have said, of course, black people draw comics. Didn't Maury Turner invent Wee Pals in 1965? So why not a black superhero in 1966? We lived in a world where anything could happen to black people. Now, in 1966, we children thought we lived in a world where anything could happen for them. I mention all of this because it is important for you to know that for my generation, when we were children, reading comics was not a pastime. It was a culture, and you cannot understand our childhood unless you know that. After the panel discussion, we will be raffling off some Black Panther swag, including a volume of the earliest issues of the Black Panther comic book and a Black Panther board game. So hang around and you may be lucky enough to win something. With that said, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Rebecca Wanzo, who will be moderating the panel today. Rebecca Wanzo is a professor and the chair of the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She is the author of The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, African American Women and Sentimental Political Storytelling, which came out in 2009, which uses African American women as a case study in exploring the kinds of storytelling conventions of people most adhere to for their suffering to be legible to various institutions of the United States. Her most recent book, The Content of Our Caricature, African American Comic Art and Political Belonging, which came out in 2020, examines how black cartoonists have used racialized caricatures to criticize constructions of idealized citizenship, as well as the alienation of African Americans from such imaginaries. It was the recipient of the Catherine Singer Novak's Book Prize from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, the Charles Hadford Book Prize from the Comic Studies Society, and the Best Scholarly Academic Work from the Will Eisner Comic Industry Award. Her research interests include African American literature and culture, critical race theory, fan studies, feminist theory, the history of popular fiction in the United States, cultural studies, theories of affect, and graphic storytelling. She has published in venues such as American Literature, Camera Obscura, Differences, our Journal of Feminist Cultural Studies, Signs, Women and Performance, and numerous edited collections. She has also written essays for media outlets such as CNN, the LA Review of Books, Huffington Post, The Conversation, and the comic book Bitch Planet. So without any further ado, I turn things over to Professor Wanzo.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to moderate this panel. The first two people I'll introduce are in my comics crew, and the before times we just follow each other around the country on various Black comics panels. So first to my left is Jonathan W. Gray. He's Associate Professor of English at the CUNY Graduate Center and John Jay College, and is the author of Civil Rights and the White Literary Imagination. and is currently working on a long-awaited book project called Illustrating the Race, Representing Blackness in American Comics. Professor Gray contributed the essay Race to NYU's Keywords for Comic Studies, co-edited the collection Disability in Comics and Graphic Novels for Paul Gray Macmillan, and served as the founding editor of the Journal of Comics and Culture. Professor Gray's meditations on race and representation in popular culture have appeared in Film Quarterly, The New Republic, Entertainment Weekly, Medium, and Salon. To his left is Professor Qiana Whitted, and I should assure you that there are not that many of us who are Black women who go to comic studies conferences, and yet I have been confused for Qiana more than once. Qiana Whitted is Professor of English and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina, a graduate of Hampton University with a PhD from Yale University. Her research and teaching focus on Black literary and cultural studies with an emphasis on American comics and graphic novels. She is the author of the Eisner Award-winning book, EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest, and co-editor of the collection on comics and the U.S. South. Along with a number of published articles that explore race, genre, and history in comics, she has written the introductory essay for the Black Panther volume of Marvel's new Penguin Classics collection. She is also the editor of Inks, the Journal of the Comic Studies Society, and chair of the International Comic Arts Forum. And I'm very grateful she didn't have to track me down with a baseball bat for the essay that I owed her for an edited collection recently that was very late. And then finally, last but certainly not least, Chris Thompson, who has not been part of our comics crew, but we welcome you. Join us. Clifford Thompson is the author and illustrator of the graphic novel Big Man and the Little Men, which will be published by Other Press on November 22nd. So, place your orders. His other books include What It Is, Race, Family, and One Thinking Black Man's Blues. His personal essays and reviews have appeared in Best American Essays 2018, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Times Literary Supplement, The Three Penny Review, and elsewhere. Thompson teaches creative nonfiction writing at Sarah Lawrence College and the Bennington Seminars. A painter, he is a member of New York Blue Mountain Gallery, which will host his first solo show in winter of 2023. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So, and I'm not sure, how many people saw Wakanda Forever? People in this room? Okay, so we're using it kind of as a prompt, so we'll talk about that, but also to think about broader issues of Black comics and issues of Black representation more broadly. So I'm going to start off with a question that undergirds the question of whether or not T'Challa should have been recast. But what is it that people are looking for in terms of representations of Black heroes? I mean, one of the things I find curious is that, you know, what's so important is T'Challa. What people are attached to, it seems like it's just the Black Panther, the suit, the idea of the superhero, but it seems like there's Black humanity there, which I think is a broader issue in terms of Black representation of comics. So what does the character of T'Challa mean? Or is it real embodiment, this idea that a human being, an actor, Chadwick Boseman, could have the possibility of being up on the big screen and being the superhero? Speaking to some of Gerald's comments, what does it mean that when we see the thing that we have desired, either in comics or television, children's books, all kinds of context. So as scholars and writers, what's behind this debate about representation? Like, what is it that people are wanting? Is the suit, the humanity? What do you think these debates are about?
So first, I just want to say thank you, Rebecca, for inviting us. We always have we always have a good time when we're together, and we haven't been together because of out there, but now we are. Honestly, I think that it's about, I mean, it really is about Black humanity, but not just about Black humanity, but about a kind of Black diversity. And so Gerald mentioned the first appearance of Black Panther, which I think is important because he, in that first appearance, outsmarts the Fantastic Four. Right? It's not about him being physically stronger, he's able to like outwit them, right? And so immediately you establish that this is a person who is at the very least well-rounded in a way that we're not often, you know, presented, right? If you think going back to the 1960s and even to the 50s and 40s, our icons were Jesse Owens and Althea Gibson and Jackie Robinson, and these are all sort of physical specimens, right? And, you know, obviously, you know, apparently at that time Hidden Figures was going on, but we didn't know about that. And so, like, this is one of the earliest sort of popular representations of sort of Black intellect, right? And so I think that's really important for me, so.
I would say I've been thinking a lot about this because I was really attached to Chadwick Boseman, and for a minute there was on board with the recast T'Challa thing. And I understand why he wasn't recast. But I think also when we talk about superhero characters like Black Panther, we very much talk about how African Americans are not a monolith. There's many of us, there's diverse and wide representation. But when it comes to these superheroes, we very much are attached to the ones who kind of make it. We like the figures who, whether it's thinking back to Booker T. Washington or King or Obama, those who are able to sort of navigate men, I mentioned purposefully, those who are able to navigate and strategize and negotiate and make it, they sort of bring all of us with them. And there's a way in which Boseman's character, like I think about him coming up, for talking about the films, Civil War, Infinity Wars, Endgame, all of that, and then to have arrived with his own film. I don't know, we are attached to him and all that he was able to do. And so as much as I agree with the humanity and all of that, I think that there is something symbolic about his presence that makes us attached to that character through him. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would agree with the humanity piece. Just speaking for myself and my own reaction to the first Black Panther film and T'Challa, it struck me when I saw it that and this actually goes back to the comics in the 70s, that as a hero he is very unusual in that he loses to Killmonger in a fair fight, right? Usually, in any story, film, comic book, whatever, you know, if a hero loses a fight, it's because people, villains have ganged up on him, or he's been injured, or there's some sort of some sort of factor. But the fact that T'Challa, is challenged by Killmonger wins, and it's a fair fight. The question then becomes, okay, if the hero is not just, all things being equal, if the hero is not like the strongest guy on the screen or in the comic book, what is our definition? What does it mean to be a hero? And I think the story investigates that in interesting ways. And I think that idea actually is carried forward in Wakanda Forever, because now Shuri is wearing the suit, has to decide how to be a hero. And this actually comes to a kind of a crisis point during, I hope I'm not spoiling this for anybody, but during the climactic fight with Namor. At a certain point, Shuri has to decide, she has the upper hand, and she has to decide what to do. And I think that process of deciding what to do is also a process of deciding what is a hero, what kind of, So that's the significance it has for me.
Thank you. And it is tricky because characters have to have vulnerability, but there is this question about what Blackness does when Black people are vulnerable, and we're always vulnerable. So if you make them invulnerable, then it feeds into certain kinds of stereotypes of Black vulnerability, which was a conversation with Luke Cage,
Yep.
right? That
right.
said, well, do we really need this representation of a Black man who can be shot endlessly and it's not hurt? What does that mean? But thinking about Luke Cage and also some other comics like Black Lightning, And Black Panther, which I think started this certain kinds of narrative commitments to who the featured characters are, in both the Black Panther, the film, and Wakanda Forever, as well as some really key important comics in the Black Panther history, white people are not the primary villains. And some people have had issues with that, and there are reasons in the history of Black storytelling, or just storytelling in general, in Black superhero comics, and maybe the reasons in terms of Coogler's vision that shaped this choice not to have white people as the major antagonist, or white supremacy. So I'm wondering what you make of that choice.
I mean, I don't know. For me, especially in Wakanda Forever, actually, no, in both movies, I feel like whiteness is like if this is the frame, whiteness is just outside the frame as the problem. It's like the looming problem, right? It's the thing that Killmonger wants to transform Wakanda to address. It's the thing that Namor wants to, ally. Hey, together, this indigenous nation and this African nation can actually successfully overthrow white supremacy. And then it becomes an argument about, how should we actually work together to do that? So I take your point, but I think that, I think there's something interesting about that kind of contemplation, because like that's sort of like the ultimate barbershop talk, right? Like, what are we gonna do about these white people? And people go back and forth and debate that. And so there's something really true about that, whether you're a Spanish-speaking person of color or a white person of color, there's always this concern about the other, the threatening other, which is outside of our community, but always sort of present, so.
Yeah, I'm equally fascinated by this question. It's one that I have a lot and all of us do when we talk about Zora Neale Hurston, right? Where are all the white people in some of her fiction? And I think in that case, as well as here, it allows us to turn inward within community and think about the family issues, the infighting, all of the elements that we're not able to get at when we're constantly focused on that relationship or that relation with white characters or white people. And for those here who may not be aware, one of the series arcs that Rebecca is referencing here, Panther's Rage, which was written by Don McGregor with various artists, he also made a point not to have, with the exception of maybe like one character, any white characters in that 1970s run. And Marvel was really bothered about it. The editors were like, okay, well, when are the Avengers gonna make a cameo? Why are there no white characters here? And because he was working with a title they didn't think would succeed, they let him keep going. But at a certain point, he was like, they're not gonna show up. He was like, this is supposed to be a hidden African nation. Where are all these white people supposed to come from? And that choice that he made, and he was a white writer, over those 13 issues really made for some difficult and interesting conversations between T'Challa and his responsibility to his people in a way that I don't think he could have had if Claw is showing up all the time, or other white characters. So I like the conversations that choice enables us to have.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to look at, to consider that question just in the context of broader trends in comics throughout the decades, right? Like, for example, like your book, Rebecca, The Content of Our Caricature, made clear that over the decades, comics have sort of represented, the state of Black thinking, to the extent that it's of course, Black thinking is not a monolithic thing, but they have represented kind of major thrusts in Black thinking of their times, right? So, there was a time when a lot of cartoons for like I think it's the Pittsburgh Courier were sort of represented sort of, politics of respectability. Later, there were comics that were sort of represented Black rage, like Integration is a Bitch from, was it 1970 or something like that. So thinking about comics and superhero comics of like modern and contemporary times, an interesting question to me is like, well, what do they represent? And in a thoroughly unscientific way of thinking about this, like going to Black Lightning and Static and Luke Cage and even Black Panther, I was thinking about who the enemy is, right? And sometimes it's the government, sometimes it's other black people, sometimes it's black criminals or drug dealers or whatever. And I think black criminals are very different from like a white-run government. But what I think they have in common is that the people who are at least ostensibly supposed to be allies end up becoming enemies. And I wonder if that is a representative of like a sort of sense of betrayal, like where we are now, like in post-civil rights America. Like this is not where we're supposed to be. It's like we've been betrayed in various ways and from various sides. And so I think maybe the fact that there are like other oppressed or non-white people as villains is a kind of representation of that.
Thank you. And Qiana, you mentioned the Don McGregor run, which was so key for the first Black Panther. And one of the interesting aspects of Black Panther and Wakanda Forever is it includes so many different iterations produced by different creators. And so I'm wondering whose visions you think are particularly important for these films, like which comics runs are important because, and to your point, Cliff, like they represent different kinds of political moments. And sometimes it's interesting, they sort of represent retro moments, like a moment in the 90s that's representing 70s exploitation, right? So I'm sort of how you might talk about whose work you think is really interesting, and people who might not have read the comics might want to sort of take a look at some of these runs and how that sort of influenced the films.
You first.
Am I first?
You're first.
So recommendations of other titles and creators. I mean,
And why they're important or
And-
interesting.
So I do love the McGregor run, even though it doesn't have the technology that we love so much and that Jack Kirby worked into Fantastic Four. We don't get the mechanized jungle and the gadgets. I love seeing him issue after issue just face a new foe every time. I'm a big fan also of Christopher Priest's run from the 90s. He was he the first Black writer on Black Panther, and sort of made T'Challa, I don't know, 1990s cool in a way that he was not before. And Priest has certain feelings about writing a Black comic that he talks about in those traits. So those are my two top. I would say it is interesting in terms of whose vision is worked into the film, that what I see are a number of Coogler and other creators grappling with the legacy of the outlines of a character created in the 60s by these two white and Jewish creators who, sort of threw everything out there based on Jungle Comics to try to give us the hero that Black readers would enjoy in '66. And ever since then, it's just figuring out how to make that work in this decade, which is why characters like M'Baku are so fascinating to figure out how they're going to work with him. But anyway.
I didn't think that was going to work. I was like, how are you going to make that? I was like, you can't make.
Embodied.
Man
and yet
ate-
he did. And yet he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, it's Reginald Hudlin's run is, I think, really important. Hudlin it's interesting that he's writing right after X-Men the movie has come out, and so the idea that comics can become these successful franchises is sort of present. But one of the things that he does, and Priest restores all the technology, but Reggie Hudlin, pardon me, he actually makes Wakanda a 2,000-year-old empire, right? And so that, for me, was a sort of a really important step to give us this kind of continuity that, you know, I mean, and so if you think about the appeal of Ethiopia, as an example, its appeal is that it's the unconquered nation, right? And so Hudlin really tapped into that and sort of like took Ethiopia like times 1,000 and turned that into this nation that has you know been preeminent since humans were sort of forming civilizations, and that.
Does he bring in the Panther God also?
Yes.
Hudlin does that.
Yeah. So he does a lot of the work that you see in the first Black Panther film. A lot of that is riffing off of Hudlin, although not the M'Baku part. That's the genius of Ryan Coogler to flip that into new meaning. But for me, that's like, you know, that lineage is really important, and we see how impactful it is in the film.
He also fixes the Dora Milaje.
Yes.
Which was something that Priest did, but in this sort of blaxploitation way, in which, and there's a lot of theoretical frameworks that think about Black superheroes. Like there's this one book that sort of thinks about it's just another version of blaxploitation comics or blaxploitation films. And
Right.
the Dora Milaje were deeply sexist to the Priest run, as much
Yes.
as I like the Priest run, but Hudlin makes
That is
them
true.
better.
Yes.
What's
Yeah.
your thoughts?
Oh, I was just going to say, I really appreciated the Ta-Nehisi Coates story. I think because of the complexity of the people who were opposing T'Challa, you know, the kind of revolutionary nature. And you know, you read it and you think, yeah, they
have a point.
They got a point. They got a point. So you know, so it becomes very complex. And also, you know, because of when I grew up and when I was reading Marvel comics, I mean, you know, I will always have a soft spot in my heart for Jack Kirby, and you know, so you know, I recommend looking at those and then you know, fast forwarding and yeah, it's interesting. Like the just so many hands on it over the years. It strikes me that it's a bit like. It's almost like a folktale, you know. It's like it keeps being added to, you know, like Spag Lee or something, you know. It's like, you know, so.
And so I didn't warn you I would ask this question, but what I'm thinking about here too is something you all said, maybe think about this, or you specifically, Cliff. There was a lot of discussion about Black Panther, the film, and I think it speaks to larger questions about desires for inclusion in Black culture that we're seeing in lots of contexts. But I think there's something about the superhero comics and film, inclusion in literature, et cetera, about whether or not what makes it valuable as a Black cultural product, that it's revolutionary, and the question of what makes something revolutionary. And one of the things I think is complicated about Black comics is that there's a desire for inclusion, that if you're including it in the sort of normative frameworks that are there, maybe what's important is that it's not revolutionary, that it fits into capitalist frameworks, that it fits into frameworks that are normative and traditional. So I'm just sort of curious about where you think revolution fits in, because there's so many people who are like, it's revolutionary, and there are all kinds of reasons it could be. Like, for the film, his below-the-line casting, you know, practices were at least they were more inclusive and very different. But the narrative itself, you know, or even in like Black comics that we're seeing, I'm thinking, for example, you know, that there's lots of evidence that when writers and creators try to do revolutionary things, Marvel and DC, but particularly Marvel, is going to shut it down, right? So when, for example, Bob Morales, who was a writer for Truth, Red, White, and Black, which is the Black Captain America story before Falcon, and he had a run of Captain America, but then they shut it down because he wanted to do this thing where like Captain America only embodied the values of the suit and all these other things, and they just thought that was too much. So I'm just sort of curious about what you think about the idea of what makes what audiences are wanting is this thing that's really revolutionary in terms of Black radical politics, when really a lot of what people are wanting is sort of normative, inclusive fantasies. Just gonna ask.
Oh, man. Wow. That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you could. I suppose you could define revolutionary as what Black people want. You know, is that a good definition? You know, so you know, if people respond, it's like, yeah, it's about time that we got, you know, X. We've never seen X before. You know, we've never seen whatever X is. You know, a story in which there are no white people. A story, you know, in whatever it is that we haven't seen. Maybe that's a good benchmark for you know. And you know, if you go back a ways, what we've never seen at a certain point was just Black people. You know, so you know,
Right.
you know, and I'm thinking of Peanuts. You know, somebody wrote to Charles Schultz and said, you know, how about having a Black kid? And he thought about it, and he did, and the result was Franklin, who has the poor kid is not allowed to have a personality because anything he did would be criticized by somebody, right? So, but on the other hand, you know, he was there, you know, and I think the revolutionary thing in that day was, wow, there's a Black kid in Peanuts, you know.
Right.
We have not seen this. So whatever in whatever age we're in, the thing that people just want to see that is not allowed to happen or has not been allowed to happen for some reason.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I feel about the Woman King.
Well, that's interesting.
Just gonna say.
So,
Yeah.
Steve Bannon says that culture is above politics, and like everything else Steve Bannon says, that is incorrect. And like one of the ways that you see that is going back to Captain America. During the Watergate hearings, which was a moment when American values were in crisis in 1973, Captain America gives up the uniform and becomes Nomad, the man without a country, right? And so it's like you see how political changes then produce the reality in the comic, right? The origin of Luke Cage is tied very closely, and people say, oh, it's blaxploitation. Luke Cage is a Black man who's been convicted of a crime he didn't commit, who then goes to prison where he is abused by violent prison guards. This is 1973, less than a year after the Attica uprising, right? And so you see how these characters are emerging quite literally in response to sort of cultural changes, right? And so now there is, when the political moment changes, I think it's important then to domesticate the character, right? And so if you read the comics, which I still do, today Luke Cage is the mayor of New York. Like, wait, what? Right? But like, so this is how, and of course, well, wait, who's the mayor of New York? Oh, right. Like this knucklehead Black guy, right? And so the comics are quite literally mirroring the shifts and the changes in the politics of the day, right? So, so for me, I think that as certain things become thinkable, the comics are going to, you know, step in and try to represent these new possibilities. So.
Well, I like the way both of you all put that, and I will say the conversation about Franklin I love because I just recently finished reading your analysis of Franklin and Peanuts, which is excellent in her book. So, plug for that. But I will say, so what I tell my students, and I didn't come up with this, many other scholars have, is that superheroes are very much about upholding the status quo.
Yep.
As much as we want to call them revolutionary. And key to their characterization is the illusion of change, which is, I think that's Pete Coogan. And we can argue and talk about exceptions, but the illusion of change has to be central if you're going to keep the origin story the same, the main characterizations and motivations the same. They can only venture so far from that before they're snapped back. And so I like the idea that as things become thinkable and as society changes, our expectations change. But in many ways, I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that the first Black Panther ended with this call to share the resources and intelligence of Wakanda with the world, and part 2 says that was a mistake. Because now look what's happening, and we need to close ranks. And there's a way that, you know, we continue to return to those same problems. In 1966, that issue of the Fantastic Four, it was about protecting vibranium,
Yeah.
the call for resources. I think about all Negro comics from 1947, one of the first comics written and illustrated and published by African Americans, features a story, Lion Man, who is protecting, he doesn't call it vibranium, but Magic Mountain with its uranium or something like that.
Right.
So I think there is something interesting and notable about this return to some of those same plot lines, and it also suggests that even when we think we're being, I don't know, revolutionary, countercultural, and so forth, that there's that push to return to some of those old questions.
Right.
So in response to that, I mean, you know, what always, quite frankly, I can't stand about that Fantastic Four introduction of Black Panther is, you know, when he's, you know, accomplished his goal and vanquished his enemy, he's like, now I don't know what to do. In the 1960s, what could I possibly help with as a Black man in 1966? And so he needs the white people to tell him, you can help us save the world. And so it speaks to this really challenging relationship that superhero comics often have in dealing with race. Like, it's all over, and particularly as we have more Black readers, and they're trying to deal with what it means to be supernatural, and you could possibly make all these interventions. And there's the famous issue of Green Arrow and
Oh, good Lord. Now that's my
with
least
his-
favorite. Oh my God.
That moment where he's just with the Green Lantern, and he's like, this older Black man says, I hear you helped the purple man, and I hear
the
you helped the greenskins, but what about the Black
So
man?
bad.
Black
Oh my God.
skins.
So, because it's this problem, and one of the theories is that the Marvel, it turned to the galactic, so it didn't have to deal with the domestic, right?
Right.
So I'm just curious about how you all think about this question of dealing with being a superpowered character, and this speaks to, like, you know, what does it mean in that first Black Panther to deal with, you know, there was this push, like, you have to help people. If you have all this power, what does that mean for you politically, right? So how do you think, in terms of comics you think of that are interesting in dealing with this issue, or even the Black Panther films or comics, the issue of racism and discrimination and colonialism with superpowered heroes that seem to never really do enough?
So for me, it's funny that you, although I agree with you wholeheartedly on that ridiculous Green Lantern thing, I always took that push by the Fantastic Four in light of, like, the UN and, like, the non-aligned, like the problem of non-aligned countries, right? So you're either with the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc in the 1960s, or you're with the quote-unquote free world, right? And so for me, I took it as like much like a very direct, oh, we didn't know that you were capable of being an asset in the world, but now that we know, you with us, right?
That's interesting.
You know, you're not going to be with the Soviet Union, you're going to be with us.
And I read it more as like Qiana's containment. I feel like
Right.
it's a way of containing him.
Right. So, I mean,
Both.
yeah, no, right.
But we're all right.
Yes. But yeah, but I mean, so I do think that that's an interesting thing, but I think it's important, the idea that the idea of a global community. It's like, oh, like it's funny because at the time, like, the Avengers, it was like Black Widow is a Soviet spy who defected, right? And that was really important, that's who she was. And, you know, Iron Man was a weapon maker for Vietnam who had seen the light, right? And so they were all sort of like, they were all addressing, you know, that moment. So I always saw Black Panther as part of that, trying to build this, like, this global super community of, like, UN heroes, right? So.
I need to be refreshed about the thread of this question.
So,
'Cause I'm
what do
trying to
you,
remember.
how do we think about the struggle to deal with racism with superpowered beings who never seem to do quite enough? And it's not just black folks, but it just seems like black folks would have a particular imperative.
That's right.
One would think, but.
Right.
What comics help us to see that in different ways?
Or
maybe?
just the problem of it, the challenge of it.
Milestone.
Well, I was thinking about other alternative approaches. So Milestone, which was an imprint, an independent company run by African Americans that contracted with DC Comics. So Static, people know Static Shock, Icon, what were some of the
Blood
others?
Syndicate.
Blood Syndicate.
Hardware.
Hardware.
Black
Yes.
Lightning, so you had-
Black Lightning wasn't part of
It
Milestone.
was not part of Milestone?
I don't
Okay,
think-
all right.
No.
Okay, all right.
That's an alternative. I was thinking also, to be honest, about some of the choices made outside of superhero comics. I keep thinking about things like Bitch Planet that doesn't necessarily feature super-powered characters, but shines a light on some of these problems, whether it's patriarchy or colonialism, racism, in different ways. But yeah, I'll
Yeah.
stop there.
Well, I wonder if, it's an interesting question about like doing, superpowered black heroes doing enough, or like, I guess the question is then what would be enough, and what would that look like? And it might be tricky if, success against white supremacy or whatever in the comics kind of outpaced the real world, It's like, well, that was easy, So I wonder if the, what's important maybe is to illustrate what the fight is against rather than winning it, or rather than,
Right.
winning a fight that can't be won in the pages of a comic book.
Although, I mean, when you say that, it makes me think about the idea that, like, didn't we settle the fight about abortion 50 years ago? And like, oh, wait, no, we're fighting it now again? Like, didn't we pass like a voting rights bill so that people could have ease of access to the ballot? Oh, apparently not, right?
Right.
Like, so this idea of, it's, I call it narrative stasis.
Okay.
Right, where you have like a narrative and then it has to return back to something, right? This idea of narrative stasis, actually our country is sort of functioning inside of a narrative stasis, right? It's like, oh, Raphael Warnock is the first black senator since Reconstruction, but that means there were black senators in the 19th century, right? And so like,
Right.
what the hell is going on that we have to keep going back
Right.
and going back and going back to, so this, so maybe there is something to this idea that we can't even solve these problems in reality, right? Or rather, we know the answers, we know how to solve them, but we refuse I think more accurately, more depressingly, so.
So I'll ask one last question before I open it up to the audience. A major focus of Wakanda Forever is this focus on black women, right? And it's one that some fans have been deeply critical of, and there's also been this debate in comics, broadly speaking, about diversity in comics. Like, there are all kinds of people who just are enraged by just presence of people of color as leads. But I'm sort of wondering about how you think that's handled in the film with black women being able to be leads, but also just more broadly speaking in comics about the evolution of black women in superhero comics. I just saw someone talking about how much they loved Nubia, Real One, today, which has come a long way from like Nubia having to be in hell. I don't know if
my
y'all know,
gosh.
she was like was Wonder Woman's sister, like
Wonder Woman's black sister. From the wrong side of the tracks in
Like
Favorite
hell.
Screamer.
And dirt and clay.
She
And
from the hood of Paradise Island.
and she's just always, she was just really poorly written for a very, very long time. Like they had this little this cartoon with, I have the action figure actually. And it's like, Nubia's like Wonder Woman's fiercest foe. And it's like, is she? But, so there's been an evolution. So I'm curious just to hear you reflect on the film and also just comics more broadly. Riri Williams is in the film,
Right.
so Ironheart. to think about where we are with Black women and superhero comics and superhero representation.
Right. So, shameless plug. I wrote the review for the first Black Panther movie for The New Republic. And in my review at The New Republic, I say that T'Challa advocates one view, Killmonger the other, but Nakia is the synthesis, right? She talks about engaging with the world. Like, she is the one who is sort of, pulling the best points from these two. And so for me, it's sort of like, how are you complaining when in the first film, the most incisive person in the first film, at least politically, is a Black woman, right? And so I think this film just doubles down more on that.
Some people thought it was Killmonger who was the most important.
But those people are bad readers.
Oh,
No, but seriously, right? I mean, no. I mean, in all seriousness, right? Because, like, I had this conversation, sadly, on Twitter. Don't look for it, with someone about that, and I'm like, okay, so we know, like, that France sent their entire army to subdue Egypt, right? And they just threw bodies at the problem until they succeeded, at least in some limited sense, right? And so you're telling me that if this nation had revealed itself to be fabulously wealthy, that, Belgium, England, France, Germany wouldn't have just thrown bodies at the problem to subdue this nation prior to the 21st century? Of course they would have, right? And this is, I think, the thing that it makes it sort of fanciful, the idea that a nation of 15 million people can colonize the world. It's like, well, that was England, and that was a particular set of concerns that happened in the 1700s. We're not going back to that, right? And do we even want to be England? Like, why would we want to be England? They're terrible, right? So for me, I don't know. It's back to the original point, is that, of course, the generosity of the women in both movies is actually at the heart of everything, right? And so I don't know. I just feel like people are overwriting the narrative with what's in their head instead of taking in what's in front of them. So,
I really enjoyed seeing the women in the film step forward in ways that they hadn't in the first. I wish it had not come along with the mourning of T'Challa. So you brought up the Woman King, which is, and I don't know if that was in the context of you liking it or not, but I will just say, I figure it's probably more complicated than that, I really liked what they did with Angela Bassett's character, and Nakia. I think Shuri lacked some of the charisma that I would have liked to see. But I guess, again, coupling it, though, with our sense of loss, puts this kind of structure and this kind of storytelling at a disadvantage, which I thought was regrettable, but it was handled as well as it could have been. So, I mean, but in terms of thinking about other women superheroes and characters, you mentioned the Nubia, a real one, the YA graphic novel, which is actually very good and written by a Black writer and illustrator. And once again, this is what we do, takes the source material with all of its messed up politics and reframes it. That's what signifies on it, and gives us this really interesting story that deals with police brutality and violence and young people, and that's what the Nubia graphic novel was about. So I like that kind of development. I'm looking forward to seeing Ironheart. I really enjoyed the introduction of Riri Williams. I thought they did a really good job with that, just enough. So, yeah.
Yeah. I was interested in Jonathan's point about these firsts like Warnock. It's like, oh yeah, he's the first Black senator since Reconstruction. It's like, oh yeah, but there were Black senators in Reconstruction, it's exciting to me, what's represented by the women in Black Panther, and especially Wakanda Forever, because I can't, you could say, oh well, these are the most exciting female Black superheroes since when? Yeah, this may really be a first, unless I'm trying to think of I don't know, Pam Grier. you know,
Not in
Well,
film.
Storm, sort of.
Not
No.
in film.
Not-
Storm in books, but
Well,
not on
okay.
the screen.
No Halle Berry, we're not Halle Berry fans.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, somebody, you know, a character's given the prominence of a major motion picture release. It's hard to think of another. Like I said, you know, I go back to Pam Grier, and I'm not sure where before that. So, you know, it seems very exciting to me. Yeah.
All right, so I'll open it up to the audience for questions. Anybody have any questions, comments for the panel? Yes, Savannah.
Hi, I'm Savannah. I'm in fourth year. So I am not an expert on comics or Black Panther, so I'm just here for the ride. But I had a question about, like, from what I heard, a lot of the comics about Black people were written by white people. And so I'm wondering, like, can a white person ever really fully encapsulate the experience of Black people in these comics? Like, have you encountered one where you feel like this really speaks to, like, the Black experience? Or is there always sort of, like, holes? Because I feel like there's either, like, from one end, it's like, there's a white author, it's like, great allyship, right? And then the other end is like, you're taking seats for Black authors, and cool Black creatives. And so I guess I just wanted, like, to hear your opinion on that.
Okay. So I think, okay, so Don McGregor's run on Black Panther is brilliant, right? I mean, he does a really good job, in part with situating like this sort of African nation, this fictionalized African nation. And of course there are problems, but it's written in 1972, 73, 74, there are problems, right? When looking back at it from today's point of view. Someone who gets a lot more celebration, but I think is more problematic would be Brian Michael Bendis. But Bendis is the one who created Miles Morales, right? Brian Michael Bendis, though, although, and this is an important thing, though, he has an adopted Black child. So even as he is creating characters like Miles Morales, and he actually revamped Luke Cage, right? So he's like sort of credited with a lot of the sort of popular Black characters, but even he is like quite literally tucking a little Black girl into bed at night and thinking about what kind of stories are going to make her feel good, right? And so the question of Black authorship is complicated though, because if you change genres for a second, if you've seen the HBO show Watchmen, right? And Watchmen is Damon Lindelof, right? This white guy. Now, he did a great job of like doing research, and he had a Black writer's room, or he had many Black people in his writer's room, but it's still a Damon Lindelof thing, right? And it's brilliant, right? So I mean, it's a complicated question. So
I would just add that the question of authorship is really complicated for comics because they are a team effort. They're
Right.
collaborative medium. It's not just the writer, it is also the artist and the inker and the penciler and the colorist and all of that. And the only other thing I would say is, so back in the 40s and 50s, there were comics that were illustrated by African Americans that didn't go very far because they didn't have access to distribution. They didn't have access to publishers and so forth. So I've written about EC, for instance, EC Comics, which did publish stories about racism and segregation, and pretty violent and exciting ones. And all of the people who worked on those were white. They opened the door in a way for that kind of representation that was sustainable over time. So it wasn't just one issue, it was several. And so I want to give them credit for that, even as we acknowledge that they didn't go far enough, or there's some ways in which Black characters are silenced in those things. So it's, when you think about sort of who gets access to even tell the stories, that's the part that makes it hard. So as you say about taking space for other creators, the creators were there. They were people like Professor Early, and when he was 14, they were there. They're just not getting access to some of those outlets to produce.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's possible. I mean, I think it very much depends on the writer. And the example I'm thinking of goes outside the comics genre, but the filmmaker John Sayles has always impressed me with his black characters are, they're just like, they're like real folks, and so I don't see why that's not possible in the comics medium, so.
And I would just also add that we talked a little about Christopher Priest run, which I do like a lot, but his treatment of black women in that run is abysmal. I mean, it is just, it's a problem.
Yeah.
And there are lots of examples, I think, in black comics of representations, I think particularly of black women, that I really take a lot of issue with. And example, and a lot of people don't like this, but I'm just going to go ahead and go there. It's not comics, but let's take Tyler Perry. He's created productions that speak very much to black culture and represent a lot of what people understand about community and black family, but there's homophobia, there's certain kind of stereotypes, and his treatment of black professional women in particular is not very good. So, I mean, I just like that black people don't have a claim on authentic or always good representation of black people. There are all kinds of black people who have produced representations that we have issues with.
That's right.
Just to put that out there. Other comments or questions? I'm sorry?
There is Tim Scott.
Oh, gosh. That's from, no, I do not claim, I'm from South Carolina, but don't claim Tim Scott. Yeah, no. Yeah.
Other comments or questions?
I just edited him out, the narrative. I was like, nah, we're not gonna go with that.
Yeah.
Yes, what's up?
Good afternoon, Dennis Ford. So the question I have is, we talk about black comics. I used to read comics a little bit. I went through about 5th grade, about 7th grade, I was in the comics. How do we introduce these to our children so that we can spark and stimulate the creativity and the imagination of superheroes that should be? On tackling these cultural or political issues that need to be solved so that we can cultivate the next generation of illustrators, the next generation of writers. How do we begin to foster that conversation and introduce our young people to this world that many of them don't get introduced to?
Well, I'll just reference really quick the Nubia graphic novel again, because they made a choice. She has appeared in other comics, but the one that Rebecca was referring to earlier was specifically chosen to be young adult. It's a YA graphic novel. And the same is true for a lot of Miles Morales' series. There's different versions of it, but the one that my son reads was the one that was written by Jason Reynolds. So I really like it.
It's good.
So don't say anything bad or complicated about Jason. But I really like it. So I feel like
kill your joy, Qiana.
that's what I'm talking about. But I think those choices, I mean, if you're thinking about superheroes and how to introduce them, that makes me very happy and encouraged. I will also say my son also had the early readers of every Batman, Iron Man, or whatever, and I had lots of problems reading those origin stories of Batman and his parents being murdered. Like, those were hard to read to him, but I like what's happening for these other characters and how they're being introduced to younger readers. So that's all I would mention there. What else?
Well, about 50 years ago, I was one of these kids you're talking about. It's like, well, I think about, so my first ambition in life was to be a cartoonist, comic book artist and writer, and which I did. I did comics as a kid. They were terrible, but I was inspired by especially the Marvel comics I was reading. I think Peanuts and Marvel comics together kind of formed my sensibility. And one result of this was when I was about 15, I So, most of the superheroes I read were not black. And in fact, the vast majority of them were not. But when I tried to create a superhero, my superhero was black. So it's of course helpful, I think, to have examples of black heroes. But I think I think and we need to give kids some credit for what they can do just with different influences.
Yeah.
I didn't see a lot of black superheroes, but I tried to make one. So.
I mean, I would just add, there's a black creator named Jerry Craft who
He was
has.
just in town.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All
for a
right.
panel on banned comics.
Yeah, and Jerry has a bunch of wonderful, young adult comics that are just, they're just really life affirming and beautifully told stories. And so that's obviously outside of superhero comics, but that's, it's just good stuff. It's just good stuff.
It does seem like this is, I mean, people are always talking about the dearth of representations of blackness, but this seems like a really wonderful moment when I think about my mother trying to find anything at all in terms of black representation. It's, I had like my Virginia Hamilton, books, or there's certain books I had, but it's just like she found like the black Barbie with an afro, or she found there were just so few options. And what kids do, and people who want to be artists, like they start with comics. I mean, one thing, there are a lot of black artists who will say that they started with doing comics and reading comics, and that's what made them artists, right?
Yeah.
And so kids find comics, and now there are just so many more black representations than there ever were. I mean,
Yep.
it's really, I have a hard time keeping up because
That's right.
there's a lot out there. There's a lot.
Yeah, my son is he's a teenager, so he's reading manga, and I'm like, well, what about? He's like, man, he can take it for granted. He's just like, yes, I've given him all of the stuff his whole life. Now he's just like, I'm done with that. I'm
Right.
doing the Japanese manga stuff, and I'm like, for me, I'd have been like, oh my God, there's so much, but for him, it's not that big a deal.
Right.
So.
Any other comments, questions? Anybody? Yeah, Ravi?
Question just about sort of, distribution. Are there stores, I know like there have been stores in University City. I know there's some ICD books in New City that's an African American children's bookstore. Are there any, this would be super niche, but would there be like a graphic novels bookstore that focuses on African American comics, comics by people of color? I'm just, because we see, reading in the paper how bookstores have both gone up in the pandemic, down in the pandemic.
Right.
So I'm just kind of curious about it.
I mean, so what there are comic shops, right? And now they're like comic shops plus like Magic the Gathering cards, and it's like, these sort of like gaming culture places. And if you, it's a business, right? So if you go in there and you say, hey, I've heard about this Jerry Craft person, can you order me Jerry Craft? And, it's literally about those kinds of relationships, just like a bookstore. If you go into a bookstore and you want Bridgerton, right? And they don't have Bridgerton, but you say, well, I'd rather not buy it from Amazon. I'd rather buy it from you. Like, okay, come back next week. We'll have it for you, right? And so it's just just sparking those relationships with those, the places that are just, oh, hey, it's cards and gaming and Pokemon, but they also have Superman comics here. So that's where you ask. They'll get it for you.
I feel like there was a black woman-owned comic book store in
Amalgam.
Philadelphia that went did it go under?
It went under this year. It went
Yeah.
under about six weeks ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
So she was the only black-owned comic shop. It's called Amalgam Comics in Philadelphia, and the pandemic killed it. Unfortunately, it limped along and limped along and limped along, but now it's gone.
Because, I guess what I'm thinking about, you have to know, so if someone doesn't know about these,
Right.
like a comic book reader for a little while, but I think I like the candy store more.
Right.
It was just the whole thing, remember when it was? Harlem, and we liked the shop owner, but I liked reading comic books, but it was just
Right.
Like that, whatever they call it, third space.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, there was,
There was the one.
Right.
I mean, there's a whole conversation, and a lot of it's about gender, often about comic book shops and how welcoming they are to people, or people don't read comics, like what it means to go in, and there's a
Right.
certain kind of, like, is it a space that is welcoming? And there are also specific trends in comic buying, like, so people talk about, oh, comics are dying, but they're not. They're huge.
Yep.
Single issues have gone down.
Yeah.
But trades are huge. Young adult is the biggest. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a huge market. I mean, so now we have like millions of dollars in the market, and then and you add in manga, it's
Yeah.
a huge industry. And then women tend to buy trades more
Right.
than single issues. So there are all these sort of market trends that are shaping, what the industry looks like now.
I would also add digital comics are the way that a lot of people get those. And when you're getting it on Comixology, you don't have to go into the comic
Well,
book
it's not,
shop.
well,
that-
Comixology does not exist anymore.
Well,
Yes.
okay, through Amazon. Through Amazon. Yeah. And the way my daughter gets, she also reads manga, but she reads webtoons a lot.
Yeah.
So she's reading online.
Yep.
That's where she's reading her comics. She doesn't want me to give her any more recommendations.
Exactly. I know.
Yeah.
It's like,
a dagger in their
Yeah.
well, it's actually, in a way, it's not though, because it's like, no, I have my own taste, Dad. I'm like, okay, you have your own taste. I have one.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, comics were bad. We weren't allowed to read comics, but I grew up in the Caribbean, so that might have been part of it. And so we had to hide and read Fantastic Four and Thor and all of those comics. Can you speak to this status of comics in African American culture across the spectrum? Now?
That's a really good question.
African American comics is an interesting question. I would say, like in comics generally, thinking, when I was in high school and I wrote when I applied to college, I wrote my college essay was all about how I wanted to be a comic book artist, and I told people that, and they looked at me as if like I'd lost my mind, But this was shortly before Mouse. By
Art speaker.
thank you, Art Spiegelman, which I think, seems to me almost single-handedly raised the profile of the value of comics, at least in the United States. And I think it seems to me like it dates back to then, and I think maybe that has kind of spilled over into all areas of comics, so that it's a much more respectable thing than it was when we were kids, And I would say, with the rise of sort of more political stuff like the Boondocks and it's just a more respected art form than it once was, And I think that's across the board. I think that includes black comics.
All right.
It's-
I would put the development on sort of two tracks. One being the junk food for brains kind of version that facilitates the book burnings and all of that, and especially in the 50s. This stuff is horrible. It'll strain your eyes. Professor Early mentioned the color. The color was supposed to be bad because it was going to strain your eyes. All of the horrible instructions it gave you on how to hurt people, all those things. But you find also in African American communities and newspapers, they had their own comic strips that were really popular, and everybody wanted to read those Sunday funnies in the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier. You also have a whole line of like historical and biographical comics, and then there's the golden legacy.
Yeah.
I don't know about you all, every church had the golden legacy because you had the Frederick Douglass stories and the Amistad, like those were seen as educational. And so my research and just life shows that it seems like a lot of Black communities and organizations really endorsed those because they were like, these are the kinds of comics we want kids to read. Now, kids also wanted to read the crime does not pay comics too, but.
Right.
So you have different, certain comics are okay. And so some of the tricks are how to work the controversial stuff into the seemingly educational-looking comics.
Right.
That's where you get the Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, I'm gonna say that as someone with Caribbean family as well, the idea is that everything has to be purposeful and has to be driven towards excellence, and this is a waste of time, right? But my father was just happy that I was reading anything, right? So he would take me every Saturday, and I'd pick up more comics, and as long as I was voraciously reading it, he was fine with that. But then, like, my aunties are like, and just giving that look of disapproval, in part because of the idea of like this like very British idea of like what's proper and what's improper,
Right.
and also this very Black idea that we don't have time to waste on X, whatever X might be, right? So I think that there's, but I mean, but that's, so like in my own, experience, my father was perfectly fine. My auntie was, sucking her teeth, right? So there's like two dual tracks at the same time in my life, right? But thankfully, like the voice that is my auntie is much smaller now, and the voice that is my father is much more common now, right? Like that same aunt was like, so they pay you to read comics? And I was like, yes, auntie, they pay me to read comics. That's my job now. And she was like, oh, I never thought that. When I used to throw those things away. I'm like, I know you used to throw them away. I remember, like this whole like family dynamic drama around like what's proper and what we should be, how we should be pursuing, excellence, right? And so there's,
And it might just be worth noting as we close out here that the issue of Black comics or comics about race are very much under attack. I mean, they have been in libraries, they're in schools,
Yes.
people are teaching them. So race, gender and sexuality, they're being banned. I had Jerry Craft here because his book, New Kid, has been banned in Texas, right?
What?
Yeah, no, he's like, yeah, my book's read in translated, read in Romania, it's whatever, it's read all over the world except Texas, right? And it's like they're saying it's Marxist, it's critical race theory, just because it's about a Black kid who goes to a predominantly white school and mentions there's some racism, right? So we are in this moment
right.
where they are attacking Black creators and queer creators for their books.
Right.
And so, that are very popular, and they know kids want to read them. And that's why they're getting rid of them. So just to keep that in mind. So we need time for the raffle. Maybe if you didn't enter your name, but please join me in thanking our panelists.